Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ENACT Grand Rounds. This is our third session. I'm Elaine Morrato, and today's theme is going to be looking at the question around sustaining electronic health record research networks using an implementation science lens. We are going to structure this with a moderator. Harold Pincus will be joining us shortly. For those who may not know, Harold is co-director of the CTSA at Columbia University and has been collaborating with us on the ENACT project in its evaluation and dissemination, and brings extensive amount of experience as it relates to patient-centered outcomes research networks, quality indicators, and thinking of it from a, let's say, a healthcare delivery and ARC perspective of quality indicators. For those that may not be aware, ENACT is a research network of electronic health records. Many of you are probably at institutions that were part of the original ACT network when it was for cohort discovery. With refunding, it is now enacted so that it might be a research network to enable real-world data to real-world evidence types of questions. You can see here the representation across the country. And our grand rounds are trying to stimulate dialogue with one another on topics that relate to electronic health record data networks within the context of CTSAs and our role in accelerating and advancing translational science. So today's message for me is around implementation science. The past couple have talked about a case example and how we use real-world data for clinical questions. Last month, we were delighted to be hosting, thinking of this from informatics innovation, and today around the implementation. So this will continue again. We'll take a pause this summer, but we'll continue again with next academic year. And this is our hope that it might be a forum that brings together informaticians as well as those that are the subject matter experts and, really what's needed to accelerate the translation and sustainability of networks. We hope that the style of this talk is a little bit of us talking. I'll give a presentation and slides, a little bit of fireside chat, and the opportunity to put your questions into the chat. So we want to make sure there's time for that, recognizing that there's the wisdom of the crowd. It's not just what I'm presenting in slides, but I hope it stimulates that it might be an interesting dialogue with one another. It will be recorded or is being recorded so that it's also available for sharing with others if you have colleagues who might be interested in this topic too. Okay, so our format is my presentation, Q&A, and we do encourage you, please, a very short poll, just a couple of questions at the end that helps us make sure that we're delivering something that provides value to you all. As we get towards the end of our time together, there'll be opportunity for you to enter your questions into the Zoom chat, and I'll bring down slides after my talk, and hopefully we'll get to see you all and as I said, have conversation. Okay, a little bit about myself. I'm a professor and founding dean at Loyola University Chicago. I'm also our site PI affiliated with the CTSA with the University of Chicago, as well as Rush University. In my prior life, before I became an academic, I worked at a large Fortune 100 consumer products company where I developed and commercialized over-the-counter prescription medicines. So I've always been very interested in how we think about the dissemination or implementation the way you might if you were on the commercial side. And I try to bring that perspective to my practice. I'm also trained as an epidemiologist. So while I'm not an informatician or a specialist the way many of you are, I am a pharmacoepidemiologist, and I think about big data questions as it relates to post-marketing drug safety and surveillance, having sat on FDA advisory committees. So this question over time around how we use big data for real-world questions, not just interesting research topics, is really something I've been fascinated with my whole life. I've had the chance to work on a variety of different data networks, during the ARA, PCOR, CER time, and then more recently with ACT and ENACT. So I'm hoping that today in my grand rounds that it's some insights, maybe something that you don't always hear every day. You know, we're trying to cross over our specialties and stimulate conversation. I hope that you might walk away with some nuggets around thinking about sustainability of data networks, and what are some principles, particularly as it relates to us in academic settings, and when the initial grant funding ends, or your grant funding has been terminated in more recent times. And so what do you do as we all are trying to innovate, but also expand and hopefully impact and sustain these kinds of data networks with one another, particularly in an evolving funding and policy landscape. Okay, so I shall get started. I know for many of you, this is probably old hat, been around for a few decades, but for me, I find it very useful as an implementation scientist. And what is the purpose? What are we really trying to implement and disseminate? Is it the data itself? You know, how many millions of people are connected in a data network? Or is it the context of how we convert that data into information, our understanding of how that data was ascertained? And brought into the network, and therefore what kind of meaning can we make out of it? Inference, meaningful use of the information for decision making, and that's the wisdom side. So decision making can be things like a comparative effectiveness question. It can be like FDA saying, is this new claim or new indication approvable? Has it met a sufficient evidentiary standard? Or is it evidence that would guide clinical decision-making? And we are all working in this ecosystem in which we have to understand the data, but also understand context and how we're trying to use and interpret the data. And so I think this really is our implementation. We're not just disseminating and implementing a data network, but really we're trying to do this as a means for greater wisdom and accelerating and improving human health in our case. I teach health policy, and so I think it's always useful to know how do we get to the networks that we have today. And for some of you, I know you've lived through this, so give me grace as I go through a little bit of history. But as I was getting prepared to talk, I found it a good refresher for myself. You know, the emergent electronic health record data systems have been around for several decades. And many of the early innovators saw or could see the value of going from paper-based systems to an electronic systems. And they were willing to invest or had the resources to invest in the kinds of infrastructure necessary to stand up these kinds of data health systems. You know, I put a few here in the United States, Mayo, Kaiser, VA. More notably, as a pharmacoepidemiologist, we are often looking at data sets from outside the US, particularly in Europe, that have really truly outstanding population-based data sets from birth to death in many countries. And so what we have in the US is more of a mosaic, a quilt of how we take various health system data sets because we have fragmented data care and try to make a comprehensive whole. This really was advanced in the 2000s because I think many people saw the value of wanting to implement, you know, these kinds of data systems to get the value out of the evidence you might draw at a more cost-efficient, faster way than doing RCTs for everything. But there was a need for catalyzing this investment. That was what occurred, and I cite a couple. One in my own area, FIDA, was the Amendments Act for FDA, and that really set the stage for connecting networks as a sentinel initiative for very large national-based surveillance of post-marketing safety questions. When we had the Great Recession and ARA funding and reinvestment, that led and spurred on the HITECH Act, which incentivized meaningful use and adoption of EHR systems and really brought more attention to methods and validity for doing comparative effectiveness data with secondary data sources. This set also around the Affordable Care Act. How do you use and purpose this data for actually value-based care kinds of decisions? And so there was a tremendous amount of investment occurring in this time, new data networks, et cetera. And fast forwarding in 2016, this got codified in the 21st Century Cures Act, in which the FDA was requested to consider these kinds of large data carefully valid kinds of research questions could be used as a basis for FDA approval, as I said. And this has really spurred on, I think, in addition, a lot of commercial enterprises that are equally wanting to take advantage and repurpose these kinds of data for questions related to commercialization and regulatory registration. And then fast forward more recently, I think about the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that really accelerated and took advantage of these large data sets for surveillance, but really, how do we now visualize the data for population-based decision-making and awareness, not just for research side, and really show the value of these kinds of data structures and networks from a public health emergency responsiveness. And now we're in the era of generative AI and a variety of AI that is rapidly expanding as agents for operational efficiency, trained on these data in order to make delivery of care more efficient. So each one of these moments in time in history came with different funding. That funding helped create data networks and community. Academics learned to repurpose what they were doing so it was responsive to these various eras. And that's what brings us into today. We have, compared to 2 to 3 decades ago, a variety of very well matured data research networks, but still gaps in terms of utility. And that's where CTSAs fit in. So I pulled this from the program announcement, in which they call out 2 things that I think are relevant. One is it's expected now that CTSA programs are required to demonstrate expertise in well-integrated and developed informatics. It's not an innovation, it's an expectation that is designed in. Equally important is CTSA hubs are required to engage in what we'll call dissemination and implementation activities. So today's talk is really at the intersection of those 2 requirements. How do we ensure that this investment in data, the service and the knowledge wisdom that many of you bring, are brought to the people that might have the subject matter questions, but need help and guidance on how to appropriately use the data for analysis? I wanted to just some definitions. Not everyone knows what is implementation science, or they have their definition in their mind. The dissemination part is really with the intention of spreading knowledge. You might think of this as the advertising, a newsletter, a paper that shows up in a journal. It's all about spreading knowledge and awareness. But implementation are the strategies that are very much the human marketing of how do we think about what's necessary to say, I'm going to adopt something new. I'm not just going to hear about it and say that's interesting, but how do I actually have tools and resources that I'm able to bring into my own real practice? And that's what implementation science is trying to do. So I'm looking at the sustaining of these kinds of large research data networks through an implementation science lens, and I'm going to focus on 3 themes. One is how do we articulate a compelling value proposition, knowing that the value propositions evolve over time depending upon what other data networks are available. And thinking about our dissemination activities and engagement as something that's dynamic, almost like marketing campaigns. You don't just get one coupon and that's the last time you hear about something. It requires a lot of ongoing listening to what is important and adapting products to meet the needs of you all as customers. And then eventually, what really is the sustainable business model once a grant ends. So let me go through some information. A value proposition hypothesis is drawn from lean startup, or what we might call the I-Core or innovation core language, designing for implementation or designing with a value proposition in mind. And it's a simple hypothesis to say, why should someone care about any innovation such that they are willing to adopt and keep using, repeat, adopt, if you will. And that's really articulating what is our innovation, who is it specifically helping, that's a customer segment, and what's the job they're trying to get done, what are the pains they're trying to reduce or avoid, and what are the gains they're trying to increase. and thinking about anything that we develop in those terms and clear articulation. And the challenge we have is that we write grants for NIH or other funding agencies, and the lens we bring is societal. We're trying to show a significant statement for society. But the value proposition now is trying to bring that significance down to individual motivation so that the value is delivering a specific measurable benefit, whether that be functional, do something faster, cheaper, save lives, emotional or social. It makes my life easier. It reduces a burden. It helps me get promoted. It helps my organization meet its quality goals. And the reality is most of us, most humans adopt usually for emotional, social reasons. They might want to emulate someone else. That's why we have influencers. And so the functional becomes necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. We also have to really listen to understand what's the emotional needs, and even in the technology that we do. And we have to put that into context and think about what we're developing as academics relative to what's a competing alternative, whether that's a company like a for-profit that's trying to innovate in the same space, let's say Epic, let's say Trinetics, or a competing alternative, which is let's just stay with the status quo. What is the value of adopting? So we've been working really hard to try to understand and articulate what a value proposition might be for research data sets. And this paper was one I worked on during the ARA era, and it was SafetyNet. This was an EHR-based and administrative claims database network that was linking safety net populations, FQHCs. At the time, there was not a well-established network in that area. And we were looking at comparative effectiveness research user with different customer segments, card-carrying health services researchers, but also clinical providers and health system decision makers and health policy makers. And you can see here, everyone is looking for credible data, but for slightly different reasons. One is I really need it for research. It needs to be credible to other researchers and NIH when they review what I'm doing. Easy to access means I get the data all curated for me in 6 weeks. That's really easy. Whereas a policymaker is, I need that data now, just like what we saw in COVID. I can't wait 6 weeks. And I really need it to be very functional and easy to use so I can do planning. And for those that in the health systems, I'm really looking at performance benchmarking. So each one of these segments has a different need, and that then translates into the minimum viable product and what are the characteristics of that research network. We also learned that health services researchers come in different segments as well, experience versus new, and what they're looking for and expectations also vary. So this comes from the consumer world. Really understand your target segment and try to avoid boiling the ocean. We did our own needs assessment recently using the ENACT funding. And what we learned is these core needs remain the same. And I'm sure it's what you see at your local site. You've got to demonstrate data quality, credibility. A big pain point that everyone wants ease of is data governance, whether it's data use agreements at your local sites or MOUs with multiple sites. Making that easier is a condition of even the first step. Then we want to all do the fun part, which is the data analytics and the tool sharing. And there's a lot of creativity in academic sites for that. But it's a very human project. And it's the data informatician, it's the biostatistician or other methodologists and the subject matter expertise. And it's how do you get that whole team ready for research collaboration faster, that we're also hearing is a major pain point at many sites. And that requires, therefore, educational outreach so that everyone has a certain level of literacy and understanding so that they can come to the team ready and reliant on one another, but they also know what is prudent interpretation and use of that information. So if you're interested in learning more about this kind of work, we can talk about that during the Q&A. I like to put this in context of diffusion of innovation, and I know some of you may be aware of Jeffrey Moore's work, which was looking at diffusion of innovation as it related to technology. And I bet you most of the people here are probably techies or visionaries. You are the early markets. You see new things in new ways. And what excites you is about being first. And that's many of us in academic settings. We get rewarded for being innovative. We have to write an innovative section in our grants. But the gap is the mainstream. That's the majority. They're looking for practical solutions, things that work, things that are reliable, very easy to use. I want it to look just like I purchase on Amazon or any other, app, on my United app or my Starbucks app. I like its simplicity. And I don't have time to, be fidgeting with a lot of the details. And this is the implementation gap or chasm. If you've heard of Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, from a couple of decades ago, this is the chasm in diffusion that we have to transfer and go over. And how do we go in generating information, structuring our work and systems so that it's attractive to the pragmatists and the conservatives who are, looking for things that are going to make sense to them in a busy alternative choices. And so we put that in context by understanding the market in that way. And this came out of our needs assessment that we were doing to really understand where are the unmet needs right now in CTSA researchers. There's a paper here you can refer to and read more about it. I wanted to highlight this idea of user segmentation, but also by CTSA segmentation. Customer type is, as I said, the researcher, the informatics, the statistician, or health economist, whoever is doing the statistical analyses, and that they bring that knowledge. And each one is slightly looking for different information and ease of use as they consider what data sets to work with. But importantly, what we learned here is that our CTSAs are not all alike. And by small, medium, and large, we're just looking at the CTSA funding, how much funding for infrastructure support is there. And to some degree, this tracks right with NIH funding. And so it gives you a sense, a crude proxy for the ecosystem in which many of us are operating. And depending on if you are a small CTSA or large, how mature, robust, and large your ecosystem is will also vary. Small CTSAs may have less budget and staff to meet and train researcher needs compared to a larger. The larger one is concerned about high volume. They don't have the capacity to be providing concierge service for everyone. They expect you to figure it out on your own a little bit more. So all of these cores are needing to fill a fit to context that might be a little different. But regardless, those that do the methods and the data are key influencers over their local research community as it relates to cohort identification and design. And so it's not just about the data, but it's the ones that make the statistical meaning about the data that are key gatekeepers from an implementation point of view, and making sure that valid data conclusions can be drawn. This means that we need to target all of our users in a meaningful way and provide value, or decide which of the CTSAs really that are getting the most value out of a network like ours, for example. But within those networks, it's not just that research team. The fit to context also means that there's multiple stakeholders that are operating, and from a business lens, you might call them not influencers and recommenders, but also economic buyers and decision makers. And these are often higher up in the administration, whether it's the CTSA PI or whether it's the health system or whether it's the dean's office. They will ask the question around cost, and is this cost worth the effort? And in some cases, there might be competing networks at a site, and they end up, one may be saboteur for the other. It's just natural human nature. So what we think of then is, what's the value of any data network from each of these perspectives, and how do we start to align values so it's co-creation with one another? So here, the sustainability takeaway is really think deeply about your compelling value proposition, how we translate a societal significance into an individual level motivation, How do we think of what I'll call multi-sided value for all of these decision stakeholders? Being clear to focus on one target segment is enough. I mean, very few products at all have 100% market share. So be targeted. What is the user group that you're really trying to serve very well? Don't try to boil the ocean. And it's a rapidly changing landscape. And so it means necessary to keep validating and checking our assumptions with regard to the value proposition. The second concept relates to, well, if we have a value and we've developed something, how do we disseminate it? This language, get, keep, grow, also comes from the Innovation Core handbook, if you will. And that's thinking about your customer as a customer acquisition. In the data science side, you have to acquire someone to say, I want to try that research enterprise software out. And then you have to get them ready, technically ready. You might have to activate. And it's more than just saying, here, have a password, you're in now, upload this software. It's about the user experience, it's the learning, and it's ongoing engagement. In a business world, you hope you upsell or cross-sell. In our context, that upsell might mean, in our case, you go from cohort discovery to a research enclave and collaboration. A cross-sell might be linking our network with other networks, like what you see in the Sentinel network for FDA. It's really a linkage of many different networks. And from a business standpoint, you get what they call a viral loop. So people's experiences will then feed back, and whether or not they decide to stay using it, whether or not they influence others to also acquire and activate. And it's a combination of what you get through word of mouth, but also sometimes you might have to be paying to be at meetings or conferences to advertise yourself. Even in academics, we know this. I think in data networks, what we have is a two-level adoption in which you have this get, keep, grow happening at both the CTSA hub site, in which those are working with their health system and the real-world data sharing, and the research community that is the real-world evidence generators. And so you have to have both of these actively working and getting, keeping, and growing data sharing, and then hoping that that then drives into getting, keeping, growing real research users, and that their experience drives the need of why a site wants to continue to participate in that particular network. We also know, as technology, that it's common that engagement strategies also need to be thinking of this as no different than any other technology in which you have sort of a health alpha testing development, beta testing, proof of concept, and then hopefully product adoption. And so you might think about the translation and development of a network with intentional steps along the way, and knowing that this diffusion of activity is a time-based process. So while you may have two people connected in the network, they need to alpha test something, try it out, work out the bugs before you start beta testing and expanding. And that's just a natural product of doing the implementation in this area. And so when we were ACT, and this was for cohort discovery several years ago, we had funding, and we could look at the technical readiness and acquisition, as well as the adoption as a percentage of sites. So here, purple is looking at technical readiness. You're not going to disseminate something until it's technically acceptable, and you're on the network and it's reliable. And then the dissemination is a sense of how many people are going on, and actually we're communicating that the network is open for purchase or use. And by the end, what we got was very high adoption among sites. You can look here on the right that over 80% of the CTSAs were either technically on or in process of becoming on the network. And that represented maybe 3/4 of the CTSAs had disseminated. But what we learned is that things had evolved from the beginning of when this was funded to the end. And that is the cohort discovery was not a meaningful value proposition as it had been a few years earlier. People really wanted to use these networks for research purposes. And so it took a couple of years to get refunded for a research purpose. And that therefore is a natural sustainability experiment. ACT ended in May 2021. Funding had a pause of a little over a year. But then we had to get the ACT network re-engaged and new governance, et cetera, to stand up its research use. And while money was there for the central data enterprise resources, the money had changed in terms of supporting the local data sharing side. And so this represents a natural experiment. How will people at individual sites see value, particularly after a few years in which a lot of others are innovating at the same time? I share this just for transparency. This is what happens when you stop disseminating and you eliminate funding, and you go from a level of usage down to a lower level. But the lower level is not zero. And that's where we really are interested in understanding the market use, the site use, and where people are seeing value most. And that's the segment that we want to continue to work with and to share their stories with others. And the last 6 months, as the research enclaves have been enacted, are now at that stage of re-engagement with, disseminating what is a new potential with the network. We did this assessment in which we were looking at where, this is a natural experiment. Where are things right now? Which networks are people talking about by looking at the CTSA websites? It's not saying that there's not other research networks going on, but we did an audit looking at every CTSA's website. We categorized it by size of their NIH hub funding and looking at where adoption is. And so, or at least adoption that's on a website, they're talking about it, they were disseminating it. I think what's interesting here as we were looking at this is Trinetics penetration is much higher, 68% amongst those that are the smaller CTSAs compared to the largers, almost statistically significant, even despite the small sample size. And maybe reflective of the fact that having someone commercial ready, enterprise ready, providing training, the smaller CTSAs don't have that excess capacity perhaps at their site or funding, and therefore the value of having that, pragmatically is higher perhaps in the smaller. So there's a lot to learn in this as to where different sites are receiving the most value, and so that we can be designing a network that's trying to fill the gaps. So the sustainability takeaway is that when you think about dissemination, it's not a one and done, meaning you don't just say, ta-da, I disseminated and I'm done. You have to be thinking of this as like a marketer at a company does, in which it's sustaining ongoing engagement. It needs to be adaptive. It needs to fit with the changing times. And it needs to recognize that some needs get met better by others. And so like any company, you have to pivot. I think what makes this challenging is that our research funding mechanisms are set up with, this is what I was funded to do, these were my goals, these were my aims, I have to stick with them, even though the world technologically might be evolving and changing. And I think that's what makes our particular case of longitudinal engagement tricky. Also, the dollars that are in budgets tend to go towards the technology side of things, the science side, not the dissemination and implementation. And that means we are often under-resourced to do all of the promotion, engagement, implementation that is necessary to sustain any dissemination effort at large scale, particularly when it's evolving against a changing landscape. So my takeaway is to be very intentional. We've tried to do that with ENACT by building in customer discovery so that it's built into the aims and it's okay if we adapt, and allowing that to guide where we're going at this stage of implementation. My last point is, I have just a couple of slides here, is how do we think about this now as a sustainability, a business model? Because funding ends, you get 5-year funding cycles, and you just know that the government is funding. This is what happened during ARA. They funded comparative effectiveness research networks, and then it was like, okay, now you're on your own to sustain. And so there are some common sustainability strategies. Maybe some of you are aware of others you would like to share. We would love to hear. One is a societal investment. We decide that this is so critically important that we're going to bake it into our taxes and use of Congress's funds. I would say that's where the Sentinel network fits. I remember at one point, I think an estimate at FDA is like it's about $60 million a year in order to maintain that functionality at a very high level of validity in order to inform key regulatory decision-making. The other might be a buy strategy. This is what many researchers who do work in this area, they develop really in-depth knowledge in a particular data set or research group. And like industry, they buy it. So they might have a grant and they can buy it, or they might be working with the ones that are lower cost. And that's where you might get it from CMS data. Those are lower cost, or HCUP. Not necessarily EHR, but it's other administrative claims data. And then there's a number of companies that have evolved and changed names over years, all trying to bring real world data. The value that they bring is it costs more, but it's highly curated, a data dictionary, and reliably maintained. But it's expensive. Some estimates are several million dollars in order to get these kinds of longitudinal data sets for a particular disease state. The other strategy of sustainability is one that might be a partner, a network collaboration. The network itself is many partners, and that partners then go after different funding cycles, reapplying the network. Healthcare Systems Research Network, formerly the HMO Research Network, is one such network. VA is public, but maintained in that regard, or PCORnet. So they're partnering with getting value out of the health system's data. They're diffusing, you might say, their implementation risk by working together, and you get high-performing groups that then go after new questions. The challenge is if you're not at one of those sites or not at one of those affiliated groups, you may not necessarily have access to use those data depending on the data use agreements. Oops. The other one is I'm going to call a spin-out strategy. It's kind of like a SBIR, small business kind of thing. And there are a couple of examples in which they started out with funding from governmental, but then became nonprofits. One is OCHEN, which is a premier community health organization research network made up of a number of FQHCs and others, community health organizations. When I was at Colorado, I was familiar with DARTnet Institute and their association with the Academy of Family Practice. And they focus on clinical related needs and questions and have provided value to their constituents such that, there's small licensing fee that allows the enterprise to sustain itself. Another one which we're very common about in academics is where's the next innovation? Where's the next funding opportunity? How do we pivot what we're doing and go there? And we see this with ACT and ENACT, but N3C, that was opportunistic for COVID. One more recently that is just in the evaluation stage, ARPA-H, looking at rare diseases. And that I would imagine many of you are at the tip of that next innovation and are very keyed in. That is where you have very robust informatics systems and structures. So that tends to favor the larger CTSAs than the smaller, but it's those networks that then go after the next funding cycle to continue adapting and innovating. The last is an opportunistic one, where if you don't necessarily have access to the others, but are still needing as a CTSA to be engaged, there are other such avenues like Trinetics or Cosmos, others that have enterprise, and what they're trying to do is provide value. Their primary value might be somewhere else. Cosmos, from the Epic side, they're selling the EHR. Now they're trying to have an upsell or other value in the research. And Trinetics, similarly, monetizing these data for, pharma and others who are wanting to use it for commercial purposes. So why do I say all of these examples? Mainly because we tend not to think about it. We get very excited about the data, the curation of data. I want to link this data with social determinants data, and we get very into the validity of the data. How do we easily do all of this? But if we really want to sustain what we do, we really need to be thinking from the outset, what kind of business model are we conceptualizing for ourselves? That will inform what is the kind of proof of concept, what are the partnerships we need to develop, what's the claims data, if you will, that we need to collect, the use cases, and what's the realistic expectations of what success is. Is it 100% of CTSAs using it, or is it a few core that are using it and being very satisfied? That would be how an implementation scientist looks at this question of sustainability from the outset. So I've finished my my information. This is the part where we're going to have some questions. We'll put in the chat. This is to help remind you, please let us know if this information was valuable to you. In the last 15 minutes, we're going to move to more of a Q&A dialogue, and we encourage you to enter in any questions or reflections. Perhaps you already have. I'll close down my sharing and see. Harold will come on and join, and we'll have a dialogue and hopefully bring in some of the questions that you have, whether it be current challenges, maybe some strategies you're using, maybe thoughts on how AI might disrupt all of this sustainability problem anyway, and we'll go from there. So let me stop sharing and open it up for information.
Well, thank you so much, Elaine. And I apologize for coming on late. I had problems with making the connection, but I thought it was a really great introduction to the broader concepts surrounding these kind of data networks. Let me just kick it off by, Elaine, can you say a little bit about what you think makes ENACT unique?
Yes. Well, I think what we're trying to do as ENACT is model what is a customer responsive data network and move to the development of tools or analytics that enable research and are filling a gap. So what do I mean by that? I think there's this concept of democratizing access to data, that if you are not in one of the core centers attached to some of these really high performing research networks, it's sometimes difficult to be able to get access to do research in that area. I think the other big pain point that we're trying to address is faster access to data or cloud-based research in a way that we'll call it a research enclave, but it's this problem around data governance and how can you rapidly stand up quick research questions. I'm a pharmacoepidemiologist, you're a health services researcher. It takes a lot of time and knowledge to know how to go through a data use agreement and work through all of that. Can we make those processes simpler, faster, knowing that we have a CTSA network behind us? So that's where a couple things I see.
Now,
What about, yeah.
Yeah, so in thinking about that, what can individual CTSAs do to facilitate the use of ENACT at their within their CTSAs at their institutions?
Yeah, well, I think what we're looking to learn from you all, rather than me tell you what to you all, is, and that's why we did the needs assessment, as you know, Harold, is really understand where are the CTSA's needs the greatest. And so depending upon the CTSA, how ENACT might provide value might be different by site by site. And so I think what we're trying to do with these grand rounds is show what's the opportunity of ENACT such that CTSAs want to stay engaged with not just the data sharing aspect, but to engage with us in part of the dissemination so that we're providing resources or use cases that would help the local CTSA informatics team be able to communicate value. I think the ENACT team cares very much about the data quality. So they're also looking at tool development that makes it easier for local CTSAs to be maintaining data integrity for sharing, et cetera.
I think also that, there's things that, individual CTSAs can do to, facilitate use and also to, advertise the potential use and, benefits of use of ENACT. But I also think that there's some sort of basic information that users need to have in order to understand how to use it properly.
Yes. We've talked a lot about this. So both Harold and I bring an epidemiology lens. The thing I got drilled into my head during graduate school is like data ascertainment, and really, have you done the appropriate adjustments, for confounding and potential bias, in order to really feel confident or not in what you're observing when you compare or you analyze. We saw this with COVID. There was a lot of data, a lot of analyses being used with these large real-world data sets, and they were not using the appropriate methods to make proper inferences, and then you end up with decisions and data and guidance that's not necessarily the right decision or guidance. So I think CTSA should be talking about literacy and what's like a meaningful use of this data for decision making, not just meaningful use of data for analysis, but for decision making.
Yes, I mean, bottom line is association is not the same as causation.
Yes.
And I think
And context matters, and context of how the data were collected, context of the local site, all of the, we merge all of this together and we just compare it with the clinical information and we adjust for clinical factors. We need to also be thinking about adjusting for the healthcare setting and system factors that might be influencing how data is appearing in that particular system.
from your perspective, and it'd be good to hear from other people as well, what are the sort of most common use cases that are being fulfilled here? Thinking about it from the point of view of sort of customer segmentation, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I think if you think of it, it's probably the questions that require large data. So it could be rarer diseases in which you really need to have multiple sites together to get enough cases to look at. Something in which you might need demographic or socio-demographic diversity in order to feel more comfortable about the generalizability of your finding. So one use case could be we did an implementation, a clinical decision support tool and analysis at our local site. I'd like to know how generalizable that is. And so by working with a network, I can now take that question to other sites and think about it as the generalizability of that. So it's continuing along that evidence generation. Another use case could be rapid hypothesis exploration. I think I see this in my clinical setting. I'm curious about the association, if it's just an association or causal. How can I rapidly assess that particular thing I'm observing in my own clinic? And it's almost like a signal detection. It's exploratory in nature, and that might then drive that we need more evidence gathering around something, an RCT or other sorts of kinds of studies. I think another use case that has not been tapped to, I'm a public health person, and that is, how do we use this network for surveillance reasons? Not just COVID. One thing I'm very curious about, many of our states have lost CDC funding for things that are infectious disease surveillance. The United States is not connected with the UN and WHO as it relates to their World Health surveillance of diseases. And so how do we repurpose these kinds of data sets to help us with rapid surveillance for other infectious disease? Take what we learned from COVID and apply them for other areas and think of it in that terms. And then last, we probably have a lot of people on here who teach methods. How might we use a data set that's supported by a CTSA, which is all about how do we improve our workforce in a way that this is the sandbox for learning, using this as, that real world experiential learning tool as, not just learning the method, but also learning how best to interpret, like we were talking earlier. So there are a lot of use cases. I think it just needs the early innovators to try one of them out and demonstrate.
It just made me think, as you were going through that, that one thing that might be introduced through through ENACT is, some strategy around social networking. That is, thinking about, either organizing subgroups of people that might want to collaborate, either around, particular research questions or particular topics or particular use cases.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one. We talk about that triad between someone that really understands the data, so the informatics specialist, the person who has the skill set for the statistical analysis, and then the subject matter expert who might be curious about a real question of importance. Sometimes it's all one person, but most of the time it's not, and it requires that team. And the person that might have the data and the skill is at one institution, the person that might have the clinical knowledge is at another, and so forth. I know when I started out, I was curious about drug warnings. I looked at antipsychotics and the risk for diabetes. No one at my institution, it was a large institution, but no one was interested in that. I had to connect with someone at a different institution in order to make that research project go. And that person was connected with their state Medicaid. And because they had that clinical to state Medicaid relationship, I then got access to data, and we worked together productively for 10 years. But that natural dating networking is what you're describing. Like, how can we use our CTSA network to facilitate that? Is really what you're saying, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. Any thoughts from those that are listening still? How you guys are trying to solve sustainability, or questions or problems you're facing that you'd like us to reflect on? We'll keep going.
I'm not sure how many of the people in the audience are sort of early career people, but it seems to me that ENACT also provides a good opportunity to get access to data that you would not normally be able to have access to, and to begin to maybe develop some papers for publication.
Right.
An early career person.
Yeah, if you think about like what kind of preliminary data you need to do to help support why you might want to develop an intervention or test it in a trial, a great first place to go to is looking at existing secondary data and what do you see as trends or associations where they are further. And this, because it's being supported by your institution or by the NIH, it's also a good grantsmanship thing. It's a trust, you have a trusted network in which the CTSA resources are there to help you. You're not having to do it necessarily on your own.
Other questions, suggestions?
We have two of our colleagues here, Nayeli Mora and Maddie Mihal. They've been involved as we've been doing needs assessment across CTSAs to try to understand unmet needs. I wonder if you all have anything you'd like to come off mute and say, or things that you've observed as it relates to sustainability. Maybe Nayeli?
Yes, thank you, Elaine, for this presentation. I think something that's been in my mind is always the resources that institutions have, and this conflict that they have, right, to give preference to one network over the other one. And I don't have the answer, but it's something that we have discussed is how do they make this decision based not just in dollars, maybe probably the resources that you were saying, teams, right, that they need to enable them to analyze the data. And how can we think as our network and that, how can we foster or facilitate this collaboration as a team science, right? For say I'm a small CTSA or institution, how can I provide more infrastructure or support that? And again, I don't have the answer, but that's always in my mind. But how can we overcome that barrier that has come in our interviews? And then I guess the other thing that gives me is, as we move forward, right, and what can we do to sustain the network that has been taken many years? What are we gonna do, right? How are we gonna keep it going? I mean, some of the questions that I have.
Yeah. And what you have even within NIH funding or let's say ARC funding, you have competing funding agencies that are sometimes at cross purposes with one another, or you wish that our tax dollars were being more concentrated instead of, you know, creating competing networks. So there's this desire for consolidating. This is what you have with the FDA Sentinel, but when you do that, then it sort of takes away the spontaneity and the innovation that's natural at academic institutions, right? And so it's this balance around how do you ensure at least a baseline of continuity, because it takes a time to build relationships to sustain a network. And this goes, you know, in longer periods of time than just, you know, 4 or 5 years blocks, you know. And yet our funding mechanisms are in that kind of 3-5 year funding waves, which makes it challenging too. Because as a society, we just want to fund the innovation, not the sustaining. Yeah. Harold, any closing thoughts on what you've observed?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see it, you know, and I don't know if we've fully collected, you know, all of the use cases for ENACT, but you know, given the focus of the CTSA is now on clinical and translational science, I wonder if people have thoughts about the utilization of ENACT, you know, in the service of clinical and translational science.
Yeah. Well, maybe we close this way. Thank you for coming. And, you know, you will hear from many of us because we're actively interested in understanding use cases so that we can understand how better to design and continue iterating and improving. And it's okay when people decide not to adopt something, because that also gives us learning too. And we are here to have dynamic dissemination. And so we appreciate your time with us. On here is a short poll. We have a few people who have answered. And so we appreciate it if for those it literally is just 2 questions. So with that, I think we'll leave this open maybe a few more minutes for people to do, but we appreciate your time and wish you a very good summer. We'll be back with the new academic year.